If you're not trained in being a keen reader of these enigmatic stories, you might end up with very narrow conclusions. Can you speak more generally about the need to read closely and pay attention to every detail with various examples?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a very good question, and you do have to be a very sensitive reader to read these stories. I think that's true of many forms of literature too. To read a poem and really understand a sonnet or a poem, to read a novel. That's why we have professionals. That's why we have literary critics. That's why we have professors of literature. It's to help us understand, again, Shakespeare, Jane Austen, any body of literature. So Talmudic literature is one form of literature. And one thing I think that's also really important to understand is that Talmudic literature and Talmudic stories, I mean, the halacha too, all of Talmud, but Talmudic stories are oral. They're oral literature. They're part of the Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral Torah. And this was preserved orally until the Gaonic period, until the Islamic period, until the 8th or 9th century. Throughout the Talmudic period, all of rabbinic literature was oral. There's sometimes a misunderstanding about this. They say Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi wrote down the Mishnah, or the stories, the Talmud was written down. It was all memorized. It's very hard for us to understand because we function in a literate culture, and we don't put a lot of stock in developing our memories and memorization because we don't have to. We can pick up books, we can access things on the internet now. But in pre-modern times, I mean, really before they developed the printing press, writing was very hard to come by. So even in the Middle Ages, when you had literature and manuscripts, still a lot more was memorized. But certainly in the Talmudic period, Torah Shebaal Peh meant Torah Shebaal Peh. Oral Torah meant oral Torah. So no one was really studying these stories from a text, from a book. They were learning them and they were reciting them from memory. Now, the reason why this is important is that oral literature is formulated very, very tersely for mnemonic purposes. You can't have long digressions, long descriptions, just for the sake of entertainment or for filling things out, because these things cannot be memorized. And most Talmudic stories, I mean, are so brief, so terse. They could be 50 words, 100 words, even some of the more highly developed Talmudic stories. Now, what that means for the reader is that every detail is important, because no detail was there just for the sake of describing the character, so you'd have a more accurate description of what he or she looked like, or for entertaining the audience. In fact, they're so brief, they're so terse that it puts a very heavy onus on the audience. It would have been oral for us, of course. Now it's written to try to fill in some of those gaps that the storyteller either didn't think was important or assumed the reader would be able to understand. Or what's also possible is that although, let's say in the Talmud, the story was formulated in a very brief way, again, for mnemonic purposes, so that students could memorize it, when some rabbi was actually teaching that story to his students, or in some sort of forum, he himself elaborated on that story, that is, embellished it. Maybe he knew some of the details from his study, or was, again, passed down in some other form. So what we are given in many cases is like the skeletal outline of a story that was probably fleshed out and told in more detail when it was actually being told. But for us, what that means is, for the reader, on the one hand, that makes it harder. On the other hand, it makes it easier. And it makes it harder because we wish to know a lot more, and they're just sometimes puzzling. But it makes it easier because it means that every single detail that the storyteller gives you is important. He's not wasting words. So if a character is described in any way, a particularly ugly man, a woman with long hair, whatever it is, you know that detail is important, and you know that detail's got to figure in the story. And if it doesn't figure in the story the way you notice, well, you should go back and try to figure out why that character was described in that way. There must be some reason to it. So, I'll give you a few examples of this. There's a story about a certain rabbi. He goes away to the Beit Midrash to study for many years, and he comes home after many years. Part of this story deals, well, there are actually several stories like this, but deals with the problem of engaging in Torah study as opposed to being there for your wife and family, domestic responsibilities as opposed to the study of Torah. The rabbi, one of these stories is about a rabbi named Hanania ben Hakinai, or Hanina ben Hakinai. And when he comes home, he actually can't find his way home. And the way he gets home is he hears someone calling out to a maiden who's at the well, and they say, "Daughter of Hakinai, fill your pitcher and go home." And then he trails her home, and that's how he finds his house. I mean, part of this is to indicate how long he's been away, that he can't even remember how to get home. But if you don't pay close attention, you might just think that's all there is to it. But if you pay close attention, she's referred to as daughter of Hakinai. He is Rabbi Hanania ben Hakinai, so she should be daughter of Hanania. But she's called daughter of Hakinai, in other words, daughter of the grandfather. So her very name manifests this absence, the fact that her father has been away for so long. She's essentially lost the connection to the father, and he's lost his kind of parental identity in that sense, and she's now identified in terms of his father, the grandfather, might have been home helping raise her. So just a very subtle thing the storyteller puts in there.
Criticism? Is that a pointed criticism?
It is. The story is, it's hard to know if it's criticism, because the stories are really grappling with the problem there. The problem, the rabbis think a study of Torah is a great value, and in some cases you might have to go away to the yeshiva. Especially in the old days, travel was hard, geographical distances are vast, and be away from home for years to study. On the other hand, it does take a toll on your wife as a rabbi and your children. So it's less than criticism; it's an indication of what's being lost.
Right. It's bringing out both. It's like, I see what you're saying.
It's a trade-off. You want to study Torah, fine, but you're going to lose your connection to your daughter. People won't even identify her as your daughter. Maybe that's the right choice. Maybe it's not. Some of the stories along this regard are very critical of the rabbis. Some are less critical, but it's just a way of kind of indicating, what happens in this sort of circumstance. And again, a very small detail, but something you would want to pay attention to. Or again, I was working on a story that has to do with the principle of judge every person favorably, dan the kaf zchut, right? Don't suspect person of failings or sins. So the story, this is in Masechet Shabbat, talks about a man who works for 3 years for a homeowner. He hires himself out, signs a contract to work for 3 years. At the end of that time, he asks the Baal Habayit, the homeowner, for his wages. Says, "Give me my money." And the homeowner says, "I have none." He says, "Okay, pay me in land." He says, "I have no land." He says, "Pay me in animals." He says, "I don't have animals." He says, "Pay me in fruit." "I don't have fruit." "Pay me in blankets and cushions." "I don't have that." And so he basically doesn't pay him, and this homeowner goes home devastated. He'd worked for 3 years. But then in the end, the whole point is that this worker thinks that the Baal Habayit, the homeowner, has a good reason not for paying him. He's leased out his money, he's leased his land, he's used all his money in a business venture, whatever. He was judged him favorably, and that's the point of the story. This is really suspicious behavior that you would think he's just trying to rip him off or take advantage of him and not pay him. Like, he's looking at the fruit and so on. Anyway, the story begins with a very subtle note. It says there was once a story, the story of a worker who came down from the upper Galilee to the south, and he hired himself out to this homeowner for 3 years. And it also gives you a little temporal data. It says on the eve of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, he asked for his money, and he doesn't get it. And then it's after Sukkot, the homeowner comes and pays him off. Now, those temporal data, when it happened, and the geographic data seem like peripheral or marginal to the story. The story would work perfectly well without them. You didn't have to tell where he lived, or you didn't have to tell what time of year it was. But you have to ask yourself, why did the storyteller throw in those details? So they really add a lot to the story, because the fact that the the worker came from the upper Galilee down to the south to find work. Probably indicates he's very poor. He couldn't find work nearby. It means he was probably unable to visit his wife and children during those 3 years because he was so far away. And it also indicates when he goes back home, he's got to travel for several days. And you can imagine him traveling for days with this terrible news to his wife and his children. I actually don't have any wages. So it just enhances kind of his magnanimity in thinking this homeowner did not rip him off, but also the poignancy of his experience. And likewise, when he goes home, Yom Kippur, of course, the day of judgment, when you would think of sin and trying to do mitzvot and what's kind of foremost in his mind at that time, and the homeowner doesn't pay him then. And Yom Kippur is the day of judgment. That intersects a little bit with judge everyone favorably, which he did. But also he goes home and the homeowner also pays him after Sukkot. So we're supposed to imagine him trying to celebrate Sukkot, Zman Simchatenu, the time of rejoicing where we most want to be feasting. And he was looking so forward to that festival week with his family. And he comes home with nothing. And you can imagine them trying to celebrate Sukkot without his wages. And again, it's only after that his contractor comes and pays him off. So again, very subtle details. And again, the story could work without them, but by paying attention to them, it really enhances your appreciation of the story and what the storyteller is trying to communicate. And he does it so briefly and so tersely. He doesn't go into long paragraphs as a novelist would by telling you the emotional state of this worker when he came home and how devastated he was and what he said to his family. I mean, we're supposed to kind of imagine that based on just the fact that it was during this time of year. Or again, just one other example, just as it's very famous, the stories of Hillel and Shammai. They're approached by Gentiles, and the Gentiles say, convert me standing on one leg, or they ask them other questions that are unreasonable. And Hillel is very patient and kind of responds in a very patient and nice way, and Shammai's, more impatient and kind of rude almost. Anyway, the story says that at one point, one of these Gentiles who comes to Shammai and says, convert me while I'm standing on one leg, says Shammai drove him away with the builder's cubit that was in his hand, with the ruler, the measuring rod that was in his hand, right? So we imagine, Shammai trying to strike him, driving away. What kind of a preposterous, ridiculous condition is this? Convert me while I stand on one leg. But again, it's a very subtle form of characterizations, because why is Shammai holding that builder's cubit? Why did he have that builder's cubit in his hand? Well, again, it's telling you he routinely had this implement because that was probably his common practice. He was always impatient. He was he had this ready in his hand because whether it was a student or an obnoxious questioner or a Gentile who came with this sort of demand, he was ready, and was always ready. So again, it characterizes Shammai as someone who does have a lack of patience and is not gentle and so on, just by that one little description. So really every word that the storyteller communicates, you have to pay attention to.
Well, it's like a literary device, like as they say in the literary world, that it's showing, not telling, right? So that's kind of what's happening over there.
Yeah, that's a very good point. It's all showing. If the narrator says anything, it's like one brief statement, again, just to focus you on something. There's one story. It says, Rabbi, whatever his name, Elazar ben Dordaya, there was not one prostitute in the world who he had not visited. That's the extent of the telling, and that tells you everything you need to know about this man for the purposes of that story. Right? But that's all you're going to get for characterization. Now, that's very clear. It doesn't take a genius to understand how this man is being characterized, okay? But really, every detail is important. But like I said, because the stories are so brief, once you get attuned to asking yourself, why is this told? Why is this description here? Why is this city mentioned? It does open your mind to interpret the stories, I think, at a much higher level that you might expect.
Yeah, and Benzi mentioned before in this question that you might end up with very narrow conclusions. Like, one of them that came to mind was one of the stories in the book Land of Truth, where you discuss the rabbi who was seduced by his wife, thinking that she was someone else.
Mhm.
His name escapes me. So that you can kind of end up with a conclusion that celibacy is the ideal, but if you really dig in deep, it's saying that no, that's going to lead to
what it led to.
What it led to exactly.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
maybe you can give us a little bit of that story, because I think it's very interesting.
Yeah, well, this seems to be this is about a rabbi who apparently thinks that sexuality is connected to desire and the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, as it often is, right? We often lust and we often have desires for illicit sexuality over and above what's licit or what's permitted. So this rabbi seems to have taken it to an extreme, and has essentially, although he's married and his wife is there, has taken what we might call a vow of celibacy, not a formal vow, but a resolution to not engage in sexual relations at all, because he associates them so strongly with the evil inclination. And his wife hears him praying once more at one time, may God save me from the evil inclination. And by this, she understands that it's not that he's unable to have sex, he's gotten so old, but that he's fighting this battle every day. She had not even appreciated this. So she sets out to seduce him one day, dressing up like a prostitute and walking before him when he's studying. And in the end, does succeed. He's overpowered by his lust that he's been trying to, just his normal sexual feelings that he's trying to suppress for so long. And ends up having sex with her. Then he feels horrible about this, and he goes and he jumps into an oven, trying to burn himself, punish himself for this illicit sexual act that he's committed. Now, the wife at that point reveals herself to him. So it turns out it was actually a permitted sexual act, because it wasn't a prostitute, it was his lawfully wedded wife. So in fact, he hasn't sinned, or at least hasn't sinned in the classic form of sin, that is committed an illicit act, but he's intended to do it kind of as a function of this failed effort at celibacy. And the end of the story is, he seems to have killed himself in this oven. What's interesting here is that some printed versions of the Talmud, we use a printing of the Talmud that was printed in Vilna in the 19th century. It goes back to earlier printings, and sometimes this printed version is a little corrupt. There were Talmud manuscripts that were preserved from the Middle Ages, sometimes preserve better readings, and sometimes the printed version is either censored or along the lines of what we were saying before. It doesn't like to portray rabbis in quite as negative ways as they're sometimes portrayed in the Talmudic stories themselves. So the printed versions give a little more optimistic ending, that he didn't actually kill himself. But in the real version of the story, in all the manuscripts, he ends up killing himself. So what the storytellers seem to be saying here is that he, wrongly associated all sex with the evil inclination and aspired to celibacy. Perhaps it seems to be under the influence, perhaps, of Christianity of the time. This story might be anti-Christian polemic. Again, this didn't really happen. This is a fictional story that ends in disaster. But the storytellers seem to say, celibacy is not really a viable option for human beings. And this rabbi did the wrong thing by taking on this kind of marital celibacy. And, here the storytellers are really brilliant, because they have the story sin, they have the rabbi sin in order to suggest that he was on the wrong path, but they can't, even the Talmudic storytellers can't quite bring themselves, at least in this case, to really have the rabbi engage in relations with the prostitute. So the prostitute is the wife. So it's very paradoxical. It's a sin.
Honor to some extent.
Yeah, he intended to sin. He didn't really sin. Don't think he really would have done it. It was his lawfully wedded wife. But they're telling you he was really on the wrong path, that this kind of celibacy is not really viable and not really preferred. And, I don't have to tell anybody today the problems that the Catholic Church is dealing with these days, with the sexual abuse scandals and so on. there might be something to be said for this Talmudic story, but certainly it's coming at from a Jewish perspective and probably addressing either Christianity or rabbis who are influenced by Christian holy men who are trying to engage in these vows of celibacy at the time and trying to distance the audience from that. Yeah.
Wow.
Amazing.
It also could be addressing, sinning in thought and not versus sinning in action, which is really what the sin is. And it's kind of saying, like, stop creating these extra fences, like Chava and the, not touching the tree as opposed to not eating from the tree. So we have this idea in Judaism, don't be a fanatic, basically.
That's right. That's certainly part of what the story is going on, and in the context there, it exactly deals with that sort of issue. Trying to distance yourself in permitted ways. If you treat the permitted as prohibited, you'll ultimately violate the prohibited.
Exactly. Fascinating.